President of UNH. It's my privilege to present this program on behalf of UNH and to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Richard Haass. Richard is a global thought leader on international affairs, president of the Council on Foreign Affairs, and a longtime friend of UNH, and it's an honor to have you with us today, Richard. I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator, Alynna Lyon, a professor of political science at UNH and a renowned researcher, author, and scholar on foreign policy and international organizations. As New Hampshire's flagship public university, presenting speakers of this caliber is an essential part of our mission to bring research expertise to our state that improves the quality of life and enriches our understanding of the world beyond New Hampshire. I'd also like to recognize our alumni community for sponsoring today's event, which would not be possible without their generous support. Thank you for bringing us this conversation. I'll now tell you a little bit more about our guest speaker. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and an established leader of some of our nation's most influential nonprofit institutions. Since 2003, Richard has been the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. He is a Rhodes Scholar and holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a master's and doctor of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He's also received numerous honorary degrees, including one from UNH in 2016 when he was our commencement speaker here in Durham. Richard is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and one book on management. His most recent book, The World, A Brief Introduction, is the focus of today's event. On reading his book, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote, quote, "It is hard to imagine anyone more suited for this ambitious task than Richard Haass. His narrative flair, depth of expertise, and wide-ranging knowledge sparkle on every page." I can't imagine a better endorsement than that. So if you've not yet had the opportunity to read it, I encourage you to add it to your book list. It's a fascinating, informative, and important text for our time. At the beginning of his career, Richard served in the U.S. Departments of State and Defense and was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. Later, he was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, he was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his distinguished contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield. From 2001 to 2003, he was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he directed the policy planning staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Richard, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. I'd also like to introduce Professor Alynna Lyon. She is our moderator this afternoon, and she joined the UNH faculty in 2003. Alynna attended New Mexico State University, where she received a Bachelor of Art and Master of Arts in Political Science, and she earned her PhD in International Relations and Affairs from the University of South Carolina. Her research focuses on international organizations, the United Nations, US foreign policy, and peacekeeping. Professor Lyon is the author of the book, U.S. Politics and the United Nations, and is a co-author of both The United Nations, 75 Years of Promoting Peace, and The United Nations in the 21st Century. She is past chair of the International Organization section of the International Studies Association here at UNH, and is a faculty fellow for the Office of Senior Vice Provost, Engagement, and Academic Outreach. She is co-editor-in-chief for Global Governance and has served as faculty advisor for the UNH Model United Nations since 2003. Thank you, Professor Lyon, for moderating. I know we're all looking forward to an engaging conversation, so I will hand things over to you to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, President Dean, and welcome, Dr. Haass. I'm delighted to be here. Before we get started, just a few minutes of housekeeping. I know that we have all become very familiar with Zoom and webinars, but I just want to remind you that the chat function is turned off. However, there is a Q&A function, a little tab at the bottom of your taskbar that allows you to ask questions. And so I'm going to invite you to fill that question and answer section as we go along. And I will do my very best to make sure that we get as many questions in as possible. So Dr. Haass, I will just say I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with you. I feel like you and I every couple of years get an opportunity to sit down and talk about the state of the world. And it's amazing to me how different those conversations and the context is over the past couple of years. So I'm excited and delighted and honored to talk about your new book. This is really a celebration of it. And I will just say I have to chuckle a little bit at the title. The title is The World, A Brief Introduction, and there is a bit of irony in one of those words in the term brief, that it begins with a 400-year look at global history. It then goes region by region, and in some cases, country by country, methodically through the world, and talks about the challenges, the opportunities, the history, and provides amazing depth, and then goes into think about specific global issues. And so it is really not a brief introduction. It is a masterpiece in terms of bringing all of these pieces together in a very accessible format. So given that, my first question is really looking back before we look forward and thinking about history and that 400 years of history that you reviewed. So my big question is really builds on that book. And then in a recent article, you wrote something, and I'm going to quote you: "We are living history. People in the Renaissance did not think they were living in the Renaissance." So given that, and given your understanding of world history from this research, what era do you think that we're living in? How do we label this? Is it something that is defined by COVID-19 or something else?
First of all, thank you. Good to be with you, Professor Lyon, again. I want to thank the president. I would be remiss if I did not point out my most significant UNH connection. As valued as my degree is, and as honored as I was to be a commencement speaker, I am married to an alumnus of the institution, who's actually now on your board of trustees. So that is my real UNH connection. Look, I'm glad you asked about history. Just to be the book, though, yes, it was tongue in cheek, the title, to write a book called The World. On the other hand, it is only 300 pages because I didn't want to turn it into, shall I say, the textbook equivalent of War and Peace. I was scared if I did that, nobody would pick it up. Or if they did pick it up, as was once said by a friend of mine, when you put it down, you'll never pick it up again. So I didn't want to run that risk. So my hope was, if I make it short enough without sacrificing coverage, just maybe I'll get lucky and it'll be people's first book, but not their last book or their only book. So that's the goal. In terms of history, there's no perfect parallel. The old line about history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think what you do when you look at the past, you look for examples of situations or behaviors from which you can glean insights or understandings but history isn't the equivalent of a cookbook with detailed recipes. But again, it's still useful indeed. I know there's students on this. My own preference is that if students want to go into the business I've chosen to go into, I can't think of a better thing to study than history, just in terms of the perspective, the backdrop it gives you. In terms of the current, if you divide it into three slices, one is in terms of, we're seeing once again a revival of great power rivalry. Well, there's any number of examples of that. In the modern era, there was twice in the 20th century, in the run up to World War I and World War II. There was the Cold War, was a 4-decade experiment in great power rivalry. A recent book a couple of years ago about the U.S. China relationship goes back to the Peloponnesian Wars and Athens and Sparta. So you can, there's a lot of stuff in the past about major powers jockeying and no shortage of material. I think what's slightly different about this, and again, you've got to be sensitive to differences, is China is a competitor, but economically it's very involved in the world. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was largely a political, military, ideological challenger, China is all those things, but also is economically present. So some of the policies and the like that worked vis-a-vis the Soviet Union are not going to work vis-a-vis China. It's one of the reasons, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I don't find the phrase New Cold War terribly illuminating. It's a good example to me of using a historical parallel or reference, which may distort more than it really illuminates. I think the second thing about this period is the prevalence of global issues. We've had global challenges before. 100 years ago, it was the Spanish flu. So it's not the first time we've had a global infectious disease that caused extraordinary damage. But a lot of the global issues are very different. There wasn't an internet. There wasn't the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Terrorists, while they existed, did not have global reach. Climate change was not on the agenda. And so what we have now is a whole raft of these global issues. Some are new, but the sheer number of them and their impact is qualitatively different. It's in many ways, to me, it's the most distinguishing feature of this era of history. And then, as if this were not enough, this combination of great power rivalry reviving and all these global issues, you've got the United States going through one of its periodic eras of doubt and confusion and discord and inward looking and so forth, not quite sure what role it wants to play in the world. And again, there's any number of examples from our inception where the whole idea was to focus on the development of this country rather than on international relations. The United States really got into World War I belatedly. As soon as World War I was over, again, pretty much withdrew from the world, got into World War II reluctantly and belatedly. And what's so interesting then about the next 75 years is we stayed involved in the world through the Cold War and in the 3 decades since, for the most part. But then towards the end of the Obama administration and accelerating under the Trump administration, we've moved away from positions of leadership. And Trump administration moved away from many aspects of involvement altogether. Mr. Biden has reversed that, and in many ways is back in the mainstream of post-World War II American foreign policy. But that doesn't settle it once and for all. One of the questions is how much endurance or traction will this have? Or to put it another way, what's the exception and what's the norm? Are the last 4 years the exception and now we're back to the norm? Or are these 4 years going to be the exception? And then what was Mr. Trump's foreign policy, a version of it will return. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. But again, what one can do is look to history to look at what are the implications of a United States that is uncertain about its involvement in the world.
Thank you. So building on that and looking forward, and you mentioned, doubt and confusion about U.S. role in the world. One of the things that I think about is the Biden-Harris administration and their agenda. We have a new administration with a very different agenda, and looking at their to-do list, it's extensive. It's just, it's a bit daunting, so we go from COVID-19, a global pandemic, economic recession and challenges in places like that in China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, Yemen, Myanmar, the list is very long. So I wonder, how does the Biden-Harris administration orient itself? How does it prioritize? And are there things that you recommend? These are the things that really should be focused on, because we know time is limited, resources are limited, they can't do everything.
You're exactly right. And your depiction of their list, their inbox as daunting is spot on. It is daunting. When you run for president, you can choose your running mate. If you win, you can choose your cabinet. You can choose what it is you say in your inaugural address. The only thing you can't choose is your inbox. That doesn't change. That's there regardless of who wins. You don't get to choose it. And this is daunting in the number of issues, in some cases in the complexity of issues, and in the fact that there's a large number of international issues and a large number of domestic issues. One in the saying, so Mr. Biden and Vice President Harris, they have their work cut out for them. And again, that's not because of them, it's simply because of the situation they walked into. When you buy a house, real estate agents say the most important thing is, there's three laws of real estate: location, location, and location. I kind of think right now, in the short run, next 6 months, I'd say it's COVID, COVID, and COVID. There's tremendous pressure on a human level. We just marked last night the terrible milestone of 500,000 Americans dead. We don't want to be marking many more milestones going forward of that sort. We've got to get COVID under control, but also that's the only way to get the economy going. UNH has been quite remarkable on what you've been able to do with having students and teachers in classrooms. That's the exception. You look around the country. I worry that for a lot of young people, we've lost a year. And by the time this has worked its way through might be a year and a half. And for some young people in elementary school, we may never regain that time. So we've got to get this country, both for immediate economic reasons, but long-term social reasons. We've got to get COVID under control. And unless we do that, we can talk about every other domestic challenge we have, from infrastructure to crime to you name it. And it just won't happen. So that to me is the most important. It also has an important international component. It's the best way I can think of to reestablish our reputation, or some of our reputation, for capability and competence. I think having the vaccines, several of them come from the United States, is a help, but we've got to vaccinate. And again, the good news is we're making some progress there. And the traditional, thinking about the priorities, again, domestically, I'd say in the short run, COVID and the economy. In the longer run, it's a long list, from race issues to infrastructure issues to schooling issues to immigration. Again, we can make a long list. And then the international, it basically falls into those two boxes I was describing about: things to do with great powers and things to do with all the global issues. An effective way of approaching both, though, is to strengthen our relations with our allies and our partners. It gives us much more leverage. If we approach our relations, say, with a China or Russia, or if we approach climate change or structuring the internet or dealing with an Iran or North Korea, if we have partners, it gives us a much better foundation for the policy. And again, it's another reason you're seeing the Biden administration do just that. And then, I've talked about this in the past, but I think it also helps to think about, I often just sometimes talk about repair versus building, those things which you've got. Or another way to think about it, what are the issues that check two boxes, both urgent and important? There might be terribly important issues, but you got a little bit of time on them. China might fall into that. There's no crisis in U.S. Chinese relations so far. With Russia, same thing, I would say, particularly since we've nailed down the extension of the nuclear arms control agreement. But when I look at the inbox that you described, things like Iran, things like Afghanistan, things like our participation in the global vaccination effort, those are issues that can't wait and are important. So those would be on my short list of things to focus on. In addition to something that perhaps people who have never worked in government really think about, every president gets to appoint something like 4,000 people. So to identify those people, get thousands of them confirmed, get them in offices, particularly amidst COVID-19, to get the processes and systems up and running in a rigorous way, that is easier said than done. And the world doesn't always say, okay, we'll give you some time. We'll just put the world on pause while you sort yourselves out. It doesn't work that way. So in addition to focusing on these couple of issues that I think are both urgent and important, getting the administration up and running is a real priority.
Excellent. That's a great segue to my next question, which is really focusing on the Biden team. Now, we don't have time to go through extensively, but there's just, it's really interesting to think about, the Trump foreign policy team it came in, for example, Secretary of State, a former CEO of Exxon, the first U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, executive experience, but no foreign policy experience. So let's just talk a little bit. I'm interested in your view on, for example, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, Ambassador Greenfield Thomas for U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Jake Sullivan, UNH's own Jake Sullivan, who with affiliation to the Carsey Institute for National Security Advisor. Any comments on kind of the team that he's putting together and what that might say about U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, Doris Kearns Goodwin once wrote a book about Team of Rivals. If she wants to write about this group, she can just call it team. She can save a couple of words. These are people, they've worked with one another in the past. They get along well. They share views of the world to a large extent. The good news is you'll have fewer leaks, less friction than you often have in government. I think the challenge will be to avoid groupthink. Whenever you have a lot of people who are comfortable, the issue is who challenges the emerging conventional wisdom on an issue. And in each one of the things I talked about, whether it's dealing with global vaccination or dealing with Afghanistan or dealing with Iran, I think we're gonna get some early indications or answers to your question, which is how is this team functioning? And the only caveat I give is I've worked in now four administrations. The way an administration tends to handle its first crisis is not necessarily indicative. Almost all administrations have problems for the first crisis, just making the trains run on time and so forth. It's almost like you don't want to have your first, the first game of the season isn't the Super Bowl. You want to have preseason, then the season and all that. And every administration learns from crises. And so my hunch is this administration, again, it's experience, they've worked together, they'll still learn things. And in my experience, administrations often evolve over time.
Excellent. So I think we'll dive into a particular statement that President Biden said a few weeks ago, and then we'll turn to look at some specifics like China and Russia. So President Biden, and this builds on a couple of questions that are already in the chat, said a few weeks ago, America is back. America is back. Diplomacy is at the center of our foreign policy. So I wonder, I studied the United Nations, which I think is, one of the premier places for foreign policy. And I recently wrote that, the UN isn't like an Etch-a-Sketch. You just can't shake it and reset and everything's clear and you can just kind of go back in. And building on that, even with traditional allies like Germany and France, there have been bruising, and the Canadians and the Australians weren't too happy with us over the last 4 years. So how do we engage diplomatically with allies that are fairly bruised right now? And how do we start that engine back up? Any thoughts on that, particularly as many of the agreements and alliances that we've had, we've withdrawn from, right? So things like the TPP, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iranian nuclear deal, all of these things that we kind of invested in with our allies, then we pulled back on.
I'm gonna take a 30-second detour since your background's with the UN. This morning I did some television and it's as everybody knows, Black History Month. And I was asked to name a figure who I respected. And I mentioned the first senior American at the United Nations, Ralph Bunche. Mm-hmm. And he was part of the founding of the UN. He was the UN's troubleshooter and envoy for Palestine, for Cyprus, for the Belgian Congo. He was the first African American to get the Nobel Peace Prize because of his work done with the United Nations. So I would hope some students would look at his history because he's an extraordinary individual. He was also, by the way, the first African American who became a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So it has certain resonance there as well. And since there are students involved in this, again, that's one of the career paths they should think about, is some path that involves international organizations, whether they be the UN or the World Health Organization or NGOs, Médecins Sans Frontières, the International Rescue Committee, what have you. It really is an important and interesting way to be involved in these issues. Look, I think allies in Europe in particular, also in Asia, they welcome the fact that the United States is talking to them and listening to them. They welcome the re-embrace of multilateralism. But where I part from Mr. Biden, from President Biden, is in the phrase, America is back. We're not back yet. One is what I referred to before, we've got to get things better here at home, in particular, COVID, the economy. We've got tremendous domestic challenges before we are back. And then secondly, and this is beyond his control, the rest of the world won't see us as back until we have a political rotation of power. And they see, whenever it is, whether it's in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, at the congressional or presidential level, what the Republicans bring to power. And for the last 70, 75 years, from Truman in many ways through Obama, for all the differences in our presidents, Republican and Democratic, and I've worked for both, there were more similarities than differences. If I may offend someone and yet again use a football metaphor, we mostly played the game within the 40-yard lines of midfield, some slightly to the left of center, some to the right of center. Mr. Trump was a real departure from that. And they were closer to an end zone in many ways. And the question is, will Mr. Biden be a 4-year respite? And then we go back to some version of Mr. Trump or Trumpism. Or will Mr. Trump prove to be something of an exception? And even when Republicans come back in positions of power, they look more like previous Republicans than that one. We don't have the answer to that. But to answer your question, allies want to know that answer. They want to know exactly what is the United States? What have we become? What do we plan to be? What do we plan to do? And until they have an answer to that question that they feel confident in, I think there'll be a degree of distancing and hedging that we haven't seen for quite some time. There's also just some objective differences about how to deal with China, how to deal with Iran, how to deal with Russia. But way beyond that, I just think there's a real loss of confidence in the United States. So again, in Europe and Asia, they'll welcome the general thrust of this administration's foreign policy, but they are going to be patient to see what the longer term trajectory is. The one set of allies that may not welcome this administration nearly as much are in the Middle East. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and some others who actually were fairly close to the previous administration, had issues with the Obama administration, and are wary of what Mr. Trump may do, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, also on issues of human rights for the Saudis, on the Palestinian issue for the Israelis. The fact that the phone calls President Biden made, say, to the Israeli prime minister came after a month of his being in office, in some ways symbolized to me that the set of allies who might be least comfortable, at least now, with the new administration are probably to be found in the Middle East.
Excellent, thank you. And again, a good segue. So let's dig into a couple of specific issues in particular areas. And I think I'd like to just talk briefly about China. I often think about the China paradox in that it is, we have this enormous economic interdependence, it's expansionist, it's not playing by the rules, but we need it as a partner in several different cases. One of our alumni who I'm in contact with frequently reminded me last time you and I had this conversation that you mentioned, this is his quote, Monday, China would be an enemy, Tuesday, a friend, Wednesday, it's a question mark. So I wonder what you think and what your thoughts are on China and whether this assessment is still accurate and where there are places for progress. And one of the questions that come from the chat really is about the Uyghurs and potential genocide and human rights issues. And so this goes from economic issues to North Korea to regional stability issues, and then even getting into human rights and pro-democracy issues.
This is probably the single most important bilateral relationship of this era. And as goes the U.S. China relation, so a lot of other things will go in the region and in the world. It's going to be difficult. The United States and China are very different in our systems, economically, politically, very different interests. And right now, the United States disagrees with China profoundly over what's going on inside China. You mentioned the Uyghurs, Hong Kong. We disagree with many Chinese economic practices, theft of intellectual property, the scale of government subsidies. We have real differences with what you might diplomatically describe as muscular Chinese foreign policy on the border with India, South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis Japan. What's interesting is this is a rare area of considerable bipartisanship here. You'll actually see more continuity than change probably between the Trump and Biden administrations on China than just about any other issue. Not exactly the same. There are some significant differences, but considerable continuity. And that's because it's largely an American reaction to Xi Jinping. There were hopes about how China would evolve over the last, you've disappeared there. Are you okay?
I am.
Okay, then I'll keep going. There were hopes about how China would evolve. Those hopes did not come to pass, real disillusionment in the United States. So you've seen a much tougher line towards China emerge, as I said, across party lines. I largely think it's in reaction to China. I think the structural challenge, the way I'd put it going forward, is can we push back against China where we must in all the political and economic and strategic areas I mentioned? But can we do it and one, avoid escalation or confrontation? And two, can we do it in a way that does not rule out cooperation between the United States and China where it might make sense, say on dealing with North Korea or dealing with Afghanistan or climate change or reforming the World Health Organization or what have you. And that, you began with my comment a couple of years ago, my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday comment. This is going to be difficult because what you're talking about is a relationship between these two countries that doesn't have a single personality. And it's almost like having a relationship with an individual who has multiple personalities. It's very, very hard. And so this will put a real premium on statecraft, on diplomacy for both countries. And again, can we compete? Can we flat out disagree? But can we avoid having conflict? And can we manage our competition and all of our differences in a way, again, that doesn't preclude selective areas of cooperation where it makes sense? I don't know. That will be the challenge for this administration and subsequent administrations.
Excellent. To move on to another challenging area, I was going to ask a question about the Middle East, but there's lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to leave that for question and answer. But I think about Russia. Russia isn't something we've talked about a lot for the last 4 years in terms of U.S. foreign policy initiatives there. And I think back, for example, to the Obama administration's effort to kind of reset that relationship. And the context is so different now. There is no reset. Russia has proven itself to be much more aggressive, more unilateral. They're fighting, they're kind of engaging in a really different battlefield, efforts to undermine democracies throughout the world, cyber attacks, those types of things. So I wonder, how does the Biden administration start on a path towards, an engagement or a policy with Russia? This is, it's a really, and again, issues of democracy and human rights come up, economic issues in Eastern Europe come up. So again, it's a multifaceted issue, and yet something that really needs quite a bit of attention. It
does. And some of what I said about China applies. It won't be one-dimensional or the relationship. It was interesting. I think it's noteworthy that one of the first foreign policy actions of the Biden administration was to extend the U.S. Russian nuclear arms control agreement for another 5 years. So that hopefully at least limits competition in that realm. But in virtually every other realm, we disagree. And I don't think it will be reset. I think for as long as Mr. Putin is in power, this will be an extraordinarily difficult relationship, far more disagreement than agreement, and a dangerous relationship. Now, I don't know if Mr. Putin plans to act aggressively in other parts of Europe. Could be. He's been busy in Georgia and Ukraine. I don't know what else he might do. He's used force in a rather wanton way, in a reckless way, really in a terrible way in Syria. He tries to assassinate his political opponents. He is, shall we say, he has been rather active on the internet, at a minimum carrying out espionage against us on a large scale. So my sense is we're not going to come to agreement with Russia. We'll respond to these behaviors that we reject, whether it's public criticism or sanctions. We'll probably look, in terms of the internet, we'll probably look to ways of strengthening NATO. We're going to have to decide what we're prepared to do in parts of the Middle East. But I don't see the United States and Russia in any way resetting or coming to convergence. And I think we should still talk to them. I've never approached diplomacy as a favor. And the talking can be useful. It could be a way to give them a sense of what our red lines are, where if the lines they cross, that they will likely meet with resistance from us or have serious American responses. Talking with them, again, if it shows respect and they like that, great. If we get a better sense of their thinking, good, there's less chance of miscalculation. But as difficult as the U.S. Chinese relationship is, I can still see some areas of cooperation. With Russia, it's harder. One possibility that could be limited cooperation might be Iran, only because I don't think the Russians look with equanimity on the idea of an Iran getting nuclear weapons or close to them. That doesn't, shall we say, excite them in a positive way. But areas of potential collaboration with Russia are few and far between.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to finish my questions and pivot also to some of the questions in Q&A. And this question is really about the Middle East. So actually tomorrow, the Council of Foreign Relations is hosting an educators seminar virtually titled, "Should we stay or should we go?" on the Middle East. And one of the questions coming through the Q&A is the previous administration stated they made a breakthrough through the Middle East, through many peace treaties between Israel and other countries. The participant is asking, are there some areas where the current administration should build on or from the prior administration, or should it make a clean break? So I guess this is a question really about kind of what do we do? Do we stay? Do we go? Are there things that we can build on, or is this really a hard right turn away from some of the policies of the Trump administration?
Well, the idea of leaving the Middle East seems to me a terrible idea. We may get tired of the Middle East, it won't get tired of us. Whether it's the spread of nuclear weapons or terrorism. We learned the hard way on 9/11 that terrorism is not a local concept, it can also become a global concept. We have special relations with a country like Israel, we have humanitarian interests, and there's energy interests still. So to me, the question is not whether we leave, it's how we stay, how we get involved. And we want to avoid the extreme of leave, but we also want to avoid the extreme of trying to remake the Middle East in our image. I thought the Iraq War 2003 was a massive mistake. We were way too ambitious, both in our goals, and invested way too much in blood and treasure. We don't want to go down that path. So the question is, what can we do where there's a better balance or relationship between our means and our ends? I thought the previous administration, the one area in the Middle East where they got it right was with the normalization of relations between Israel and several of its neighbors like the UAE, Bahrain. The real question is whether this administration can build on that and potentially bring Saudi Arabia. And complicated given our human rights differences and so forth, but that's a possibility. Elsewhere, I don't think the previous administration left us anything to build on. It broke more than it built. Did nothing with the Palestinian issue. United States left Syria in a way that, mostly left Syria in a way that hurt our reputation. We left the Kurds in the lurch. The United States was facilitating the Saudi war effort in Yemen towards, which had both means and ends that I found objectionable or questionable, or both the unilateral exiting of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, as flawed as someone like me thought the deal was, getting out of it unilaterally and not putting anything in its place was not a preferable policy. So I don't think the previous administration left this one much to build on, with the exception of the Abraham Accords. But those are not to be understood as peace in the Middle East. That was a rather narrow but welcome normalization of relations between Israel and several of the Sunni Arab countries. And as I said, if that could be expanded to include Saudi Arabia, that would be all to the good. And the answer is maybe it can. We'll see.
Thank you. So I think we're going to turn and look inward just a little bit. One of the works that I did talked about the dysfunctional dynamics of the U.S. political system as it impacts U.S. foreign policy. And there are several questions in the Q&A about, quote, one asks about the big lie, about the U.S. election. Someone else asks about the events of January 6, 2021, and the impacts on US foreign policy and our ability to navigate the world. There's also a colleague of mine reached out with a preliminary question from his graduate course, and I'll just read a little bit from it. These are all about kind of domestic politics and our orientation. He writes, the Biden administration states that it will look at the US foreign policy in terms of its connection with US domestic policy and its benefits for the American middle class. What do you think of that approach, particularly given that you have written that foreign policy begins at home?
When I wrote Foreign Policy Begins at Home, and I probably published that, I don't know, what, 7 or 8 years ago, it's true that that's the foundation for all we are, for all we represent to the world. It generates the resources for all we do in the world. I think that was true then, it's true now. The problem is our home front is, to use another one of my favorite words, in serious disarray. Political divisions, January 6th was a manifestation of it. But even without future violent attacks on our political processes, there's still questions about our ability to function together politically. There's racial challenges, infrastructure issues, immigration issues. Public schools, with very few exceptions, are not nearly the quality that they need to be. We've got to get through COVID. So the domestic challenges, I think, are enormous. And they'll affect, again, our ability to focus on the world, our ability to generate resources. They'll focus on the image of the United States we transmit to the world. So all of that will matter in important ways. And now I've lost the thread of your question, and I apologize. But you
Really
asked another item.
The domestic politics, and then also thinking about kind of the events of January 6, 2021, what someone talks about the big lie, and just
right.
the dysfunctional dynamics, if you will.
Yeah, look with January 6th and the refusal to accept the legitimacy and fairness and the accuracy of the results of the November election, those are real warnings about the body politic in this country. It'd be the equivalent of a patient going to the hospital and having a test or two and being shown to have a severe illness. There is something seriously wrong in our political culture. It's not simply that people are willing to use violence, which is bad, needless to say, obviously. But also that even now, months later, the overwhelming percentage of people who voted for Donald Trump still believe that the election was fraudulent when it was not. It's had 60 court challenges. It is clear it was not fraudulent. But here you are at the University of New Hampshire. This is an intellectual community. We have implicit or explicit rules for debate. We don't have those in the larger country. So how do we have a serious debate about domestic policy or international policy? There was the former senator from New York who previously was a professor at I think it was Harvard, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. His famous line was, everybody's entitled to his or her opinions, just not to their own facts. Well, now we seem to have reached a point in America where everyone's entitled to their own facts. We can't have political discourse that way. That people go to one cable channel or one internet site or one radio station and they have their quote unquote facts. And then others go to other resources and they have their set of quote unquote facts. That's not sustainable. Now I can diagnose the problem more than I can suggest to you how we get to where we need to be. And I've got my own views and I'm writing about it increasingly. And it has something to do with civics, something to do with what we teach and helping people decide what are facts and what are opinions and how they navigate the two. And it may be that we have to do greater regulation of some of our media and so forth. There's a lot of elements of this, but I would simply say this is, it is, I talked about before, what is urgent and important in our inbox. This is urgent and important because our ability to have serious public conversation about these challenges that we face, we'll never get there if we can't begin, at least from a degree of commonality, on what are some of the facts. Whether it's dealing with climate change, or any of the domestic challenges we face, or immigration. There's got to be a mechanism for separating fact from opinion, from fact from falsehood. And if there's not, then we are in serious trouble as a society and as a democracy.
Thank you. So I have a question about leading the world. So the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, the front cover says, "Can the US lead again?" And, so I study a lot of the post-war period and the creation of the UN and the Bretton Woods system, the IMF, World Bank, NATO, all of these instruments in which the United States helped craft with allies that then created a system, we call it the International Liberal Order, or whatever you want to call it, of how we engage. And the US was an integral part of kind of leadership. And I remember different times in my experience in interviews of people engaged in foreign affairs. I remember a French member of the Foreign Service saying that they wanted to be wooed and that they wanted the US to come and be part of they were looking for that leadership. And the Germans have expressed that to me as well, and many Europeans and others as well, that they wanted the US, the energy, the vision, if you want to call it in some ways, soft power, legitimacy. And there were decades in which if the US showed up, the red carpet was rolled out and they were delighted to see us. And I can say that in some places, I think we would have to kick down those very same doors today. And so I wonder, can the US lead again? Should the US lead again? And you mentioned this is a reoccurring debate. This is not 2021, this is not the first time we've had that conversation about US engagement in the world. And, I think back to Wilson and League of Nations and even the debates that happened during World War II. So, what are your thoughts? Is there a glimmer of hope about creating stability globally and US capacity to lead? Or is something else going to come along that will create stability?
There is a glimmer of hope.
Thank you.
And your answer now, the question is whether you emphasize the word hope or glimmer. Look, can we lead? Yes, but that will mean first getting our house in order at home. Not simply public health, not simply economic, but politically, in order to come up with policies and be sufficiently dependable and predictable that the rest of the world will see us as a partner. That will take some years to work out. But that's up to us. That's one thing. Second of all, leadership, though, in the future can't simply be the application of what worked in the past for two reasons. One is this is a very different world. The distribution of power is fundamentally different, many more hands. The day will come when China's economy will be larger than ours. You've got North Korea now with significant numbers of nuclear weapons and missiles. Others have economic power. The internet gives all sorts of people opportunities to get out there and have a difference. Corporations have power, NGOs do. All I'm saying is that it's a more difficult world to lead simply because even though US absolute power has grown, our relative power has declined. And that's simply a fact of life. So we can't insist nearly as much as we used to in the past. It's interesting, you mentioned France. The current president of France, Monsieur Macron, he is talking about the need for greater strategic autonomy. He has articulated positions on providing several percent of domestic production of vaccines to the rest of the world. We have not adopted, I think, unfortunately, but we have not adopted that position. He has different views on how to deal at times with Russia or China. So it's a more difficult world to lead. Lastly, intellectually, and this is maybe just as important as the other two, coming up against these global challenges, coming up against a country like China, the policies and institutions that you talked about, none of them is going to be adequate. What worked very well for the lion's share of the post-World War II era is not going to work very well going forward. We don't have institutions essentially for dealing with the digital domain, for cyberspace. We have, Paris is not even close to being an adequate institution for dealing with climate. I think I mentioned climate before. I meant the internet and digital. We don't have, the World Health Organization is clearly not up to the task for dealing with global health challenges and infectious disease, much less non-infectious or non-communicable disease. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is clearly inadequate for dealing with proliferation challenges. There's new, cryptocurrencies and the rest, and there's questions about what will constitute a monetary order. World Trade Organization can't manage the global trade space. So my point is simply, we really need a creative era in American foreign policy thinking. Dean Acheson, Mr. Truman's second Secretary of State after World War II, he immodestly published his memoir under the title of President at the Creation, Biblical Overtones. But he's forgiven. It was an extraordinarily creative era of American foreign policy, and we have essentially coasted in many ways on that now for 3/4 of a century. Well, ain't going to be another 3/4 of a century. We need to have a creative moment in foreign policy now in order to come up with new rules and new arrangements for living with everything from China to global challenges. And we just don't have the rules or the ideas or the institutions as yet. What worries me is an alternative to the kind of world that I think we want to see. I'm less worried about China because I don't think China has the answers to very much. I think it's much more likely to be a much messier world where the ability to get on top of these global challenges, increasingly the gap between the challenge and the response grows. And as we've learned, we're not immune from the effects when that happens, whether it's climate or public health. So that's the real danger going forward, is that we won't be up to it. No one else is up to it. The world doesn't organize itself. Then we've got problems.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we have time for one more question, and there's several in the chat on Iran. And one of them asked, at one point it's been talked about as a good ideal or a great deal, and some have talked about it's a horrible deal, we need to remove it. And when I think about the Biden administration, we are back, we are re-engaging. There are places like the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement, they can just flip a switch and yes, we're back in. The JCPOA is not that. We can't just say, okay, let's come back in. It's a much more challenging issue. And I know that we only have a few minutes left and it's a tough one, but I wonder if just in 3 minutes or so.
Let me just quickly say on the others, you can flick a switch and get back in the World Health Organization or Paris, but neither one of those is an adequate arrangement. So we shouldn't kid ourselves. Getting back in is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. No one should exaggerate the significance of re-engagement per se. It's a start, not an end. In terms of Iran, my own view may surprise you. I thought the 2015 agreement was a seriously flawed agreement, and I also objected to the United States getting out of it unilaterally when we did in 2018. But as a famous man once said, we are where we are, where we are. So at this point, no, I would not get back into the agreement. It's too many of its provisions are too short-lived at this point. It doesn't buy us enough time. Plus, Iran can comply with the entire agreement, yet still position itself. So by the time the agreement expires, it would be on the precipice of having nuclear weapons. And I don't think that's an acceptable situation. I worry about an Iran with nuclear weapons, what they would do with them. I worry about that others will see that possibility as reasons to go to war, or I worry that others would see that as reasons to have nuclear weapons of their own. And just when you thought the Middle East couldn't get worse, trust me, it can. I don't want any of that to come to pass. So my own view is probably the best that we could do is set up an informal arrangement with Iran, where essentially we say, here's what we're willing to live with. If you do these things, here's, say, some sanctions, a degree of sanctions relief you'll get. If, however, you're not willing to honor these limits, you will pay a price, whether it's economic or other. And I think we have to consult with the Europeans, but also the Israelis and the Saudis about what are we prepared to do to put enormous pressure on Iran, and if need be, prevent Iran from crossing certain thresholds. But to me, this agreement won't do what needs doing.
Well, Dr. Haass, thank you so much. I feel like if we, in your book is titled The World, A Brief Introduction, and I strongly recommend it. But if we were to subtitle our discussion today, it should be Around the World in 60 Minutes, because we have covered an extensive amount of material. And I really appreciate your comments and your insights President Dean, I think it's time to turn things over to you, but let me just also say to all of those who submitted questions, many of which are alumni, which I'm delighted to have seen in these. Kaylee Griffin, hello, and we're delighted to have you as an alumni participating today. And so again, thank you so much for everyone's contributions. And I'm apologizing I was able to get to every single one of them, but hopefully most of them got marked. But again, thank you, Dr. Haass and President Dean.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Haass and Dr. Lyon. Really a fascinating discussion indeed around the world in just a few minutes. I think all of us, however much knowledge we had when we came in, we're ending with quite a bit more knowledge. And, you know, the gravity of it is not to be ignored. I mean, one after another, China, Russia, Iran, really big challenges ahead. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity here at UNH to engage in these kinds of conversations, and also in the classroom to learn from professors like Professor Lyon and many others who can help our students to be good citizens by appreciating the challenges that we have in front of us. I know we have a lot of alumni on the call, so hello to all of you out there. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your support on so many fronts, and we'll look forward to engaging you again in the future. Again, thanks to everybody for making this happen. Take care.
Take care.